The first lesson of America was thirst. Not the noble battlefield thirst of a soldier fighting for the Vaterland, but a thick, cloying thirst born of dust and humiliation. For Ilse Weber, nurse of the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, captured in the chaotic collapse of the Tunisian front, the journey had been a descent into a new kind of hell. First, the crowded, stinking hold of the transport ship, where the Atlantic heaved and the air was a foul cocktail of seawater, vomit, and despair. Then, the train, its windows blacked out, rattling for days across a continent she could only imagine as a vast, uncivilized wilderness. Her mind, honed by years of Bund Deutscher Mädel discipline and the unshakeable tenets of National Socialism, had built a fortress of expectations. America, the mongrel nation, the puppet of Jewish financiers, would be brutal. The guards would be swaggering thugs, their faces slack with degenerate pleasures. The camps, she imagined, would be pits of squalor, designed to break the spirit before the body. Propaganda films had shown her as much. Jeering crowds, starving prisoners, a chaos born of racial impurity and a lack of guiding principle. She expected pain. She expected to be stripped of her dignity, to be made an example of. She clutched the iron cross on a chain beneath her worn uniform, a secret talisman, and prepared her soul for martyrdom. When the train finally shuddered to a halt and the doors were thrown open, the heat struck her like a physical blow. It was not the dry, searing heat of the desert she had left, but a heavy, wet blanket of air that smelled of baked earth and something alien and sweet. She stepped down onto a wooden platform, and her first sight of America was a sky so vast and bleached of color it seemed to erase the world's edges. Before her stretched a sea of drab, tar-paper-roofed barracks shimmering in the heat, surrounded by fences that glittered with a malevolent sharpness. Camp Concordia, Texas. The name was a cruel joke. A guard, a lanky boy who couldn't have been much older than her brother fighting on the Eastern Front, chewed on a blade of grass and pointed a thumb toward a processing building. "Schnell, Fräulein," he said, mangling the German. But there was no malice in his voice, only a profound, almost insulting boredom. This was the first anomaly. Where was the righteous fury of the victor, the sneering contempt? He looked at her as if she were not a symbol of a hated enemy, but merely a piece of administrative cargo to be filed away. The indifference was more disorienting than the cruelty she had braced for. Inside, she was stripped, searched, and deloused with a cold efficiency that was humiliating in its impersonality. They took her papers, her few personal effects, but left her the Iron Cross after a brief inspection, another small, confusing gesture. She was issued a set of blue denim work clothes stamped with a large white PW and led to the women's compound, a segregated section of the sprawling camp. As the gate clanged shut behind her, Ilse surveyed her new reality. The barracks were Spartan but clean. The other women, a mix of nurses, administrative staff, and civilian internees, regarded her with a familiar blend of suspicion and shared misery. She found a clique of the ideologically pure, women who still spoke of the Führer in hushed, reverent tones, and together they rebuilt a small, defiant corner of the Reich in the suffocating Texas heat. They held their heads high, sang patriotic songs under their breath, and interpreted every American action through the lens of cynical propaganda. The food was the second anomaly. It wasn't the starvation rations she had been warned of. 3 times a day they were served meals that were bland but substantial. White bread, something she hadn't seen in years. Coffee with real sugar. Stew with discernible chunks of meat. "It's poison," declared a woman named Magda, her face a mask of certainty. "A slow-acting poison to make us docile and weak." "Or they are fattening us up," another whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Like pigs for the slaughter, for experiments." Ilse agreed, nodding gravely. It was the only logical explanation. This wasn't humanity. It was a more sophisticated form of cruelty. They would lull them into a false sense of security before the true horror began. She ate only enough to survive, convinced each bite was a small betrayal. The days bled into a monotonous rhythm, governed by the sun and the camp routine. The American guards were a constant presence, yet they remained distant, almost peripheral. They enforced the rules without passion, their posture relaxed, their rifles held loosely. They didn't scream or strike. They were simply there, like farmers watching over livestock. Ilse's contempt for them grew. They had no fire, no ideological zeal. They were hollow men, fighting a war they didn't seem to believe in, for a country that stood for nothing but material comfort. How could such a people ever hope to defeat the disciplined will of the German folk? The true assault on her worldview began a month after her arrival. The camp commandant, a stout, middle-aged major named Davies with a perpetually weary expression, assembled the prisoners in the dusty common area. Through a translator, a captured German-American soldier with a miserable demeanor, he made an announcement that was so profoundly absurd, Ilse thought she had misunderstood. "As per the regulations of this facility, and in accordance with the Geneva Convention," the translator droned, "each barracks compound is required to elect a prisoner representative. This individual will act as a liaison to the camp administration, voice your collective concerns, manage internal disputes, and oversee the distribution of Red Cross parcels. Nominations will be accepted for the next 3 days. The election will be held by secret ballot on Sunday." A stunned silence fell over the prisoners. Ilse stared, her mouth slightly agape. Election? Secret ballot? The concepts were so alien, so antithetical to everything she had been taught, that they sounded like words from another language. Leadership, true leadership, was a matter of destiny, of strength, of appointment by a higher, wiser authority. It was bestowed, not requested. The Führer did not ask for a vote. He commanded loyalty through his inherent greatness. The idea of choosing a leader from among their own ranks, as if they were squabbling fishwives in a market, was laughable. It was chaos. It was weakness. The days that followed were a grotesque parody of order. The women's compound, once united in its sullen defiance, fractured into factions. Women began to campaign. A stern, aristocratic woman named Baroness von Lieb, who believed her title automatically qualified her, made imperious pronouncements. Magda, the poison conspirator, ran on a platform of unyielding resistance, promising to protest every meal and defy every order. Then there was Clara Schmidt. A former school teacher from Hamburg, Clara was a quiet, pragmatic woman in her 40s who rarely spoke of politics. Her platform was simple. "They want a representative," she said during a small gathering near the laundry sinks. "Let us give them one who will get us more blankets, better soap, and argue for letters from home. Ideology will not keep us warm this winter." Ilse was disgusted. Clara's pragmatism was a form of surrender. She was playing the Americans' game, legitimizing their ridiculous system. Ilse threw her support behind Magda, arguing passionately that any cooperation was a betrayal. "They are trying to divide us," she declared to her small circle. "This is a psychological trick, a Zersetzungstactic, to dissolve our unity with this decadent democracy." On Sunday, a wooden box with a slot in the top was placed in the mess hall. One by one, the women were given a small slip of paper and a pencil stub and directed behind a hanging blanket to mark their choice. Ilse watched the proceedings with a cold fury. It was a circus. When the votes were counted by Major Davies himself with 2 prisoner witnesses, the result was announced. Clara Schmidt had won by a comfortable margin. The women had chosen blankets over belief. They had chosen comfort over honor. Ilse felt a profound sense of disillusionment, not with the Reich, but with her own people. They had been corrupted so easily. Clara, true to her word, proved to be an effective, if uninspiring, liaison. She negotiated for a small patch of land to be used as a garden. She organized a mending circle. She successfully argued for access to more books for the small camp library. The library was Ilse's next battleground. It was housed in a small, stuffy corner of a recreation hut, a few shelves of donated books. She went there expecting to find nothing but American propaganda, poorly translated Bibles, and childish stories. She did find those. But she also found a worn volume of Goethe's poetry, a collection of Schiller's plays. And then, tucked away on a lower shelf, she found something that made her blood run cold. A copy of Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. The book was a ghost, a forbidden text. She had seen it burning in newsreels from 1933, a symbol of pacifist, defeatist poison that weakened the German spirit. To see it here, freely available, was a profound shock. It was a weapon left lying in plain sight. Who would do such a thing? Did the Americans not understand its power? Or was this part of the same insidious game, another attempt to infect them with doubt? Driven by a morbid curiosity, she checked it out, hiding it beneath her denim jacket as if it were a bomb. That night, by the dim light of the barracks bulb, she read. The story was not a glorious epic of heroism, but a litany of mud, fear, and pointless death. It didn't resonate with the shining stories of sacrifice her brother sent from the East. It felt true in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. It was the truth of the individual, not the Volk. A dangerous truth. She began to explore the library with a new, fearful intensity. She found books by Thomas Mann and Stefan Zweig, traitors who had fled the Vaterland. She found American magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post. They were filled with advertisements for cars, refrigerators, and smiling women in colorful dresses. It was a portrait of a nation obsessed with trivialities, a society drowning in material goods. It confirmed her belief in their decadence. But there was also an unsettling vitality to it, a chaotic energy that was both repulsive and compelling. One day, she found a stack of old American newspapers. She began to read, her English just good enough to grasp the main ideas. She read about factory production, bond drives, and troop movements. But she also found articles that openly criticized President Roosevelt. They called his policies misguided, his military strategy flawed. One political cartoon depicted him as a king with an absurdly large crown. Ilse stared at the cartoon, her mind struggling to process the implications. In Germany, the author of such an image would be taken by the Gestapo before the ink was dry. His family would disappear. The idea that one could publicly mock the leader of a nation during a war and not be executed for treason was incomprehensible. Was this another trick? Was the newspaper a fabrication designed to present a false image of freedom? Or was this real? If it was real, then American society was not just decadent, it was fundamentally insane. It lacked the most basic element of a strong state, absolute, unquestioning unity. How could they fight a total war when their own people were allowed to sow dissent? Her conversations with Clara became more frequent, more pointed. "They are trying to break us, don't you see?" Ilse argued one evening, gesturing toward a group of women listening to American swing music on a crackly radio the guards had permitted. "With bread, with books, with this noise. They want us to forget who we are." Clara looked up from the sock she was darning. Her eyes held a deep weariness that Ilse mistook for defeat. "And who are we, Ilse? Are we just the uniform? Just the party? I was a teacher. Herta over there ran a bakery. We are Germans, yes, but we are women first, and we are prisoners. If a book or a song makes this existence 1 degree more bearable, is that a betrayal?" "It is a weakness," Ilse snapped. "Strength is found in discipline, in purity of belief." "I used to believe that," Clara said softly, her gaze distant. "My husband believed it. He was a history professor. He believed in the purity of his research. He was sent to Dachau in '38 for it. They told me it was for his own protection." Ilse had no answer. The name of the camp hung in the air between them, a place spoken of only in whispers, a place where the Reich's purity was enforced. She had been taught such places were necessary, a surgeon's knife to cut the cancer from the body politic. For the first time, she saw not the cancer, but the scar on the face of the woman in front of her. The moment that finally shattered Ilse's fortress was not grand or ideological. It was small, intimate, and smelled of antiseptic. A diphtheria outbreak swept through the women's compound. It began with a few sore throats and fevers and quickly escalated. The small camp infirmary was overwhelmed. Ilse, with her training, became an indispensable figure, working tirelessly alongside the American camp doctor, a harried, overworked captain who seemed grateful for her competent, no-nonsense assistance. They worked in a fog of exhaustion, fighting to keep the women breathing. One of the youngest prisoners, a 17-year-old girl named Leni, who had been a Luftwaffe communications aide, took a bad turn. Her throat was swelling shut. A tracheotomy was needed, a risky procedure in the camp's primitive conditions. The American doctor, sweat beading on his forehead, made a decision. "We have to get her to the base hospital," he told Major Davies, "now." The base hospital was miles away, in the town of Temple. Taking a German prisoner off-site and into a military medical facility was a major security risk. Ilse fully expected Davies to refuse. A dead prisoner was just one less mouth to feed. But Major Davies didn't hesitate. "Get a truck. Sergeant Miller will drive. You," he said, pointing at Ilse, "go with them. The duck will need you." Ilse was stunned. They were entrusting her, an enemy nurse, to assist in the care of one of their own outside the wire. It made no sense. The journey was surreal. Bouncing in the back of an open-topped truck, holding the gasping Leni steady, Ilse saw America for the first time. It wasn't a wilderness. It was a landscape of rolling hills dotted with farms. She saw children waving at the truck from a wooden porch. She saw a man on a tractor plowing a field under the vast Texas sky. It was so peaceful, so profoundly normal. The war felt a million miles away. The sergeant, Miller, was a quiet man from a place called Ohio. He drove with a steady, unhurried competence. He didn't speak to her, but when Leni began to choke, he glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. At the hospital, a world of sterile white efficiency, there was no hesitation. Leni was whisked away by a team of doctors and nurses who saw not a German prisoner, but a patient in respiratory distress. The commanding medical officer, a full colonel, listened to the American doctor's report, then nodded at Ilse. "Thank you for your assistance, nurse." He called her nurse, not Fräulein, not prisoner. Nurse. The procedure was a success. Leni was breathing. As they waited for the truck to take them back, Ilse stood in a hospital corridor, her body thrumming with adrenaline and a confusion so deep it felt like a physical ache. All her training, all her beliefs said this was impossible. The enemy was subhuman, a monster to be fought and destroyed. You did not waste precious resources on them. You did not treat them with professional courtesy. You certainly did not show them the unguarded heart of your country. Sergeant Miller appeared at her side. He held 2 glass bottles, beaded with condensation. They were dark brown, with a distinctive red and white label. He held one out to her. "Coca-Cola," he said, his voice a low Midwestern rumble. "Figured you could use one." Ilse stared at the bottle. It was the quintessential symbol of American decadence she'd seen in the magazines. Liquid sugar and fizz, an indulgence. She looked from the bottle to his face. There was no trickery in his eyes, no hidden meaning. Just a simple, human gesture, a shared moment of relief after a crisis. He was thirsty. He assumed she was too. Hesitantly, she took the bottle. It was cold, the glass slick in her hand. She lifted it to her lips and took a sip. The sweet, bubbly shock was overwhelming. It tasted of another world, a world of casual, thoughtless plenty. A world where a soldier could share a drink with his enemy, not as an act of propaganda or strategy, but simply because it was a hot day and the work was done. In that moment, standing in a clean, quiet American hospital corridor, sipping a ridiculously sweet beverage, the entire ideological structure of her life crumbled. It wasn't a violent explosion, but a silent, inexorable collapse. The cruelty she had expected was a lie. The subhumanity of the enemy was a lie. The monolithic, disciplined unity of her own people was a lie. And if all of that was a lie, then what was the truth of the glorious Reich she had sworn to serve? The trip back to Camp Concordia was silent. The sun was setting, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was cooling. Ilse looked at the landscape, at the distant lights of a farmhouse, and saw it not as an alien wilderness, but just as a place where people lived. Back inside the wire, the familiar routines of the camp seemed different. The democratic squabbles in the barracks no longer looked like chaos, but like a clumsy, messy, but ultimately human way of solving problems. The forbidden books in the library were not weapons, but windows. The bored, indifferent guards were not hollow men, but simply men doing a job, dreaming of going home, just like the soldiers on her side. She never became pro-American. She still loved the memory of Germany's green forests, the sound of her language, the faces of her family. But she could no longer equate that love with the swastika. The enemy was no longer a caricature. The enemy had a face. It was the face of Major Davies, the weary administrator. It was the face of the colonel who called her nurse. It was the face of Sergeant Miller offering her a Coke. Weeks later, sitting in the library, she picked up another old newspaper. On the front page was a story about a fierce political debate in the American Congress over the conduct of the war. Senators were openly challenging the president's decisions. Ilse read the words, and a profound, terrifying thought bloomed in her mind. Perhaps the Americans' greatest strength was not their endless factories or their massive armies. Perhaps it was this: the freedom to be divided. The freedom to argue, to criticize, to be gloriously, inefficiently, and stubbornly incorrect. It was a strength born not of unity imposed from above, but of trust bubbling up from below. An order built on the bedrock of its own chaos. It was an anomaly her world had no name for, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the Reich, in all its rigid, brutal perfection, could never hope to defeat it.